Not so long ago, what happened in China mattered little to the rest of the world. Now it's the engine driving much of the world economy, but for how long? The World Bank has just released a telling report warning that without sweeping economic liberalisation, China risks its future prosperity. The report is one of the last important initiatives of the bank's president, Robert Zoellick, before he retires. In keeping with tradition, Mr Zoellick's almost certain to be succeeded by yet another American. If the position were decided strictly on merit, one candidate hard to ignore would be the World Bank's managing director and former Indonesian finance minister, Sri Mulyani, who has a reputation for calling a spade a spade. Sri Mulyani, welcome to the program.
My pleasure, Jim.
Given that the developed nations of the world have made such a poor fist of managing the global economy in recent years, does it disappoint you that your boss's successor looks almost certain to be yet another American? Isn't it time for merit rather than history to dictate who gets the top jobs in important global institutions like yours?
Well, the executive directors or the board is actually deciding about both the criteria as well as the mechanism. So I think that's already reflected that they are going to choose based on the merit.
Would you be a candidate if the opportunity arose?
Well, that's really up to the shareholder, right?
Fair enough. Is part of the problem for the successful developing countries like China, India, Indonesia, that successes come their way so quickly that they're not yet certain what global economic architecture should look like into the future, and hence, when opportunities like this do arise, they are not unified in presenting what they want?
Well, I think the emerging countries definitely recognize that their role in the global economy is becoming more and more important, as you can see in terms of their contribution of both in the export, in import or trade in general, as well as in the global economic growth. The challenge for many of the emerging countries is really try to coordinate and move in a more coordinated and coherent way in bringing as well as putting the global agenda. And this is exactly the challenge, for example, like China in this the joint study between the World Bank and the government in really putting the 2030 future challenge for China. One of the factors is how emerging countries actually play their global role in a more effective and constructive way. And this is going to be one of the test cases.
Turning to that World Bank report on China, there are few countries more important to the future of the world economy now than China. The World Bank report was very plain-speaking indeed on China's economic future. How seriously does China risk its future prosperity if it fails to modernise and liberalise its economy?
Well, definitely the structural, first the achievement that they've already achieved in the past 30 years is definitely is very commendable. But they also recognize in this case that there is a limit of this global or the growth model which they adopted in the past 30 years. Structural issue has already changed. If you talk about demography, they become old before they become wealthy. The technology frontier that they have to compete, urbanization is there. So there are quite a lot of change that need to be adopted in order for them to sustain this good performance in the past 30 years. And that is the challenge that they recognize. And this is the idea in terms of adopting more market mechanism in the land, capital, labor, how they are going to define or redefine the role of state vis-a-vis the private sector. They have to also improve their own domestic demand. So it is a very demanding, very important, and fundamentally is going to really change in terms of the way they manage the economy. It's certainly very, very critical.
What about the argument that state capitalism has served China very well in recent years, while market capitalism has not had such a good record in the lead-up and since the global financial crisis?
Well, indeed, in this case, that the model which China provided to the world is actually an effective state role in providing with the first foundation for growth for the first 30 years. But at the same time, this kind of model after 30 years is actually reaching a limit. And that is already recognized. You can see it, for example, on the land. The use of the land and the urbanization and the conversion of the agricultural land has created quite an imbalances. Distortion in terms of the interest rate or capital price is actually also creating a bubble. There is also a distortion regarding repressing the wage in this case that create the competitiveness. But at the same time, you see that many people is seeing inequality in this very high growth and high impressive performance. It will not be sustainable socially. It will not sustainable economically.
In effect, the World Bank is promoting nothing less than a top-to-bottom transformation of the Chinese economy. What indications have you had that the Chinese leadership has the courage to embark on such massive changes which could radically change the way they run their country?
You can do reform in a less painful way when the situation is really good. The reform that will be forced through the crisis is going to be much, much difficult, and usually it's going to be much more painful. So in this case, it is the political consensus, which I believe that the China authority as well as of the player there recognize that need. And they will try to manage the political process and consensus to be able to support that path.
In unveiling the report, Robert Zoellick spoke of the need for transparency and accountability. That's often code for corruption. How much of a barrier to China's long-term economic potential is endemic corruption?
Well, corruption is actually a problem in many countries in the world also, regardless the system in a way. For China, especially because of their prosperity and the progress in their economic development, the role as well as the segment of the middle class is becoming more and more important. And this segment of population is going to demand more accountability, transparency, governance. And I think this is just the natural way in which the government is going to address those issues, because not only serving their own need, but also in order to make sure that the economy will be managed in a more proper and can be enjoyed by benefit of the people. So this will also address the issue of inequality and fairness, which is, I think, is going to be good socially, politically, as well as economically for China.
As you mentioned, corruption is a problem in many countries, none more so than in your own, Indonesia. Fighting corruption was a priority when you were Finance Minister. How disappointed are you that little more appears to have been done to address the problem since you moved on to the World Bank? For instance, Transparency International suggests that the situation has changed little since the years when you were at the helm in the Finance Ministry. Are you disappointed that so little more appears to have been done?
This is a challenge for many middle-income countries, not only Indonesia, but specifically for Indonesia, because the reform has been launched, and this is the mandate since the economic crisis 97-98. People see this as really a homework that needs to be delivered by any government elected by the people.
The last time we spoke, we talked about the possibility of you running to succeed President Yudhoyono, as a candidate to succeed President Yudhoyono. Has anything changed there? Would you run if you were asked?
Well, my job now in the bank is really challenging. You know that I'm now overseeing the whole bank operation. You can imagine like 6 regions in the bank. And the challenge of the development is really make me, absorbed with this job. So I'm focusing on my job, and let Indonesia, in this case it's 2014, is still quite long. So let them choose their own leader.
What about the longer term? Do you harbour an ambition to be President of Indonesia at some point?
How about I quote Keynes, in the future we are all dead. No, I think that is a very good. We are all see. Why don't we look at my own career now? And I think the bank is very important. This is a very challenging environment as well as timing for the multilateral institution like us, and that's why I think focusing in this job is going to reward professionally for me personally, but also for Indonesia in general. They are very proud of having me here, so I think that is the way I try to dedicate myself and try to always remember about my beloved country.
Trusted economist to quote Keynes about the future. Sri Mulyani, it's been a pleasure to talk to you again.
Thank you, Jim.